The northern front was less clear. Robb Stark had trounced the Lannisters in a series of engagements, capturing Jaime Lannister. That gave the young wolf leverage. Neither Renly nor the Tyrell lords felt immediate kinship with the Starks, who had chosen secession over loyalty to any southern ruler. Still, Renly composed a letter, addressing Robb as the king in the north, offering recognition of northern sovereignty if Robb would support him in defeating the Lannisters and placing the rightful Baratheon on the Iron Throne. It was a daring proposition, one that might offend traditionalists who believed the north belonged under the Iron Throne. But Renly reasoned that the realm was already fracturing. A negotiated settlement might save lives and buy peace. Robb's acceptance was far from guaranteed, but with winter approaching in the far north, perhaps even the king in the north would see the advantage of an alliance. Messenger ravens were dispatched. Meanwhile, Renly oversaw the last details of gathering the Tyrell and Stormland forces. The bloom of spring was fading, but the roads were still mostly passable. If they moved quickly enough, they could reach King's Landing while Tywin Lannister was engaged elsewhere. Marjorie suggested that they undertake some small gestures to win the hearts of the small folk. Seeds for the next planting season, shipments of fresh grain from the Reach, small pardons for any petty criminals who had stolen to feed their families during Robert's War. These acts, while small, garnered support for the charitable king, as some began to call Renly. Not all greeted these measures with open arms. Some Stormlander lords bristled at distributing resources that could have gone to their own coffers. But Renly insisted. He had seen the realm under Robert's drunken mismanagement. He had no wish to become the kind of king who ignored the plight of the small folk. If it cost a few more gold dragons to ensure loyalty, so be it. He had the Tyrell gold, after all, and a desire to prove that he was different from both Robert and Stannis. A kinder king, a modern king. By the time the forces were assembled, the green and gold banners of Highgarden nearly outnumbered the black stag of House Baratheon. Renly could hardly complain. The Tyrells had saved him from ruin in many ways, though the presence of their armies was a double-edged sword, for it reminded him how reliant he was on their continued support. But riding out at the head of this combined host was a glorious spectacle. Thousands of infantry in half-plate, pikes glinting in the sunlight, cavalry lines with destriers clad in shining barding, and supply wagons that stretched for leagues. The air buzzed with chatter, lords comparing stories, knights boasting of future deeds, camp followers and servants hurrying to keep up. Storm's End grew quieter as the throngs departed, leaving behind a skeleton garrison to defend the fortress. Renly looked back at those high walls, once battered by a siege, now standing behind him. A memory of Stannis' final moments flickered across his mind, but he swallowed down the regret. He had a realm to mend. The march to King's Landing took weeks, partly because Renly insisted on discipline and partly because the roads were easily clogged by so many men and horses. Wherever they passed through a village, Renly ensured that the peasants were not ravaged, that wagons did not roll over small farms without compensation, and that his knights kept their behavior in check. Years of war under Robert had left many villages battered, so seeing a large host approach made some small folk quake in fear. But once they saw that King Renly demanded fair dealings, a cautious optimism took hold. Some of the Stormland villagers recalled Renly's boyish visits from years ago. He had been a bright lad, a stark contrast to Stannis' grimness. That memory softened hearts. Along the way, a raven arrived with word from the north. Robb Stark had not written the response himself, but a letter bearing his seal arrived in which the king in the north acknowledged that he would not stand in Renly's way if Renly marched on King's Landing, provided the north was recognized as independent thereafter. He made no immediate pledge of arms to Renly, but the letter indicated that the North's main focus was the Lannisters who held Sansa and Arya Stark, though in truth, only Sansa was in their hold. If Renly liberated the Stark girls, or at least offered them safe haven, perhaps a further alliance could be hammered out. Renly read the letter aloud to his council. Randyll Tarly sneered and called the Starks traitors to the realm, but Renly saw an opening. If King's Landing fell, he could free Sansa and gain an alliance with the North, preventing a two-front war. When the outer walls of King's Landing appeared in the distance, their host made camp. Scouts reported that the city was anxious. Food stores were low after the Lannister mismanagement, and the small council's attempt to stockpile grain had resulted in riots and price gouging. Worse, Tyrion Lannister was rumored to be acting as the hand, orchestrating a defense that included vast stores of wildfire. The city watch was untested in a real siege. Joffrey Baratheon, Renly still bristled at the name, was said to be growing more cruel and erratic by the day. The whispered tales of him disfiguring or tormenting those who displeased him only added fuel to Renly's moral sense of purpose. Within a day, Renly's main force had encircled the walls, establishing lines of siege engines, towers, and catapults. The Tyrells erected large pavilions, colorful in the sunlight. The Stormlanders set to building fortifications in the rolling fields outside the city. Only the riverside remained partially open, but the Reach had enough ships to impose a partial blockade there as well. Renly took a moment to stand on a small rise overlooking the sprawling city. The red walls of the Red Keep perched over the rest, a vantage that had once served Aegon the Conqueror himself. The Targaryens had been gone for more than a decade, but their legacy loomed. Now he, Renly Baratheon, brother to the late King Robert, stood poised to claim the seat once known for Targaryen might. He recalled how Robert had captured this very city from the Mad King, how swiftly the Lannisters had betrayed Aerys Targaryen to side with the rebels. The same Lannisters now cowered behind those walls, ironically defending a throne they had usurped from Robert in all but name. Fate, it seemed, had a dark sense of humor. Word spread of Renly's arrival, and on the second day of siege, a delegation rode out under a white flag. It was Tyrion Lannister himself, accompanied by a small retinue. Renly received him in the open field, flanked by Loras Tyrell and other high lords, a show of strength. Tyrion wore a confident smile, feigning calm. He was smaller than Renly had imagined, but his wit was said to be sharper than any blade. They exchanged formal courtesies, and Tyrion asked on behalf of King Joffrey if there was a possibility of peace. The Lannisters, Tyrion said, were prepared to negotiate an arrangement. Perhaps if Renly recognized Joffrey's claim, he could be named Hand of the King or some other high office. Renly did not let the suggestion linger. He told Tyrion plainly that he would not yield his claim. He demanded Joffrey's abdication, the release of Sansa Stark, and an immediate surrender of all Lannisters in the city. Tyrion laughed, shaking his head, but there was a resigned look in his eyes. He countered with talk of the stocks of wildfire hidden beneath the city's streets, the threat that if Renly attacked, King's Landing could burn, killing tens of thousands. The small council was prepared to let the city go up in flames rather than yield. Would Renly risk the innocents? This, more than anything, gave Renly pause. Stannis had died, but the ghost of that moral conflict remained. How many people would he be willing to sacrifice to claim his throne? He could see Marjorie in the corner of his eye, watching him. She did not speak, but he could sense her agreement that an assault with wildfire in play would be devastating. Slowly, Renly exhaled. He told Tyrion that if the city opened its gates peacefully, there would be no slaughter, no sacking, and House Lannister could even be permitted to keep Casterly Rock. But if they forced a fight, if they threatened wildfire, any blood spilt would be on their heads. Tyrion left, promising only that he would convey the king's demands to Joffrey and Queen Cersei. That night, in the main pavilion, Renly gathered his chief advisors. They spoke in hushed, urgent voices about the possibility of wildfire. Loras Tyrell was eager for a direct assault. He believed the city watch would fold. But Randyll Tarly advised caution, referencing the accounts of the Mad King's stores of wildfire that nearly destroyed King's Landing. It was said that Tyrion Lannister had knowledge of those caches and had been cunning enough to seize control of them, but no one knew how many remained or where they were hidden. The conversation stretched long into the night, with no clear consensus. Renly found himself remembering how Robert had taken King's Landing, through betrayal, in a sense, as the Lannister forces had opened the gates to them. Could history repeat itself? Days passed and the siege wore on. In that time, hunger within the walls surely grew. The Gold Cloaks, lacking faith in Joffrey's leadership, might have begun to question their loyalties. Varys the Spider, the master of whisperers, was rumored to hold secret parleys with certain Tyrell lords. Men from Flea Bottom tried to slip out at night, only to be turned back or captured. The stench of a city under siege permeated the air whenever the wind shifted. At last, a break came. A small conspiracy among the City Watch, bribed by the Tyrell gold, agreed to open a postern gate on the north side. Word of this reached Renly's camp through covert channels. It was a risk. Wildfire might still be unleashed and a trap might be set. But if the gate truly opened, Renly's forces could flood into the city, seize the Red Keep swiftly, and dethrone Joffrey without a prolonged siege or wanton slaughter. Renly prepared a strike force of his best knights, including Loras, Tarly, and the famed swordsman from the Reach. Under cover of darkness, they approached the gate. Tension gripped every rider. They could smell the tang of the sea, hear the hush of waves against the Blackwater rush. In the distance, they saw the looming red walls, lit sporadically by torches along the battlements. The postern gate was hidden under an overhang of stone, rarely used, in a section of the city wall that was less patrolled. When they arrived, half expecting a trap, they saw a faint flicker of light from within. A signal. Slowly, the gate swung open. Renly raised a hand, cautioning his men to wait. He expected a surge of gold cloaks at any moment, or the hiss of wildfire. But no immediate danger presented itself. Loras gave him a questioning glance, and Renly nodded. Forward. The knights slipped inside, swords drawn, hearts hammering in their chests. The gate led to a shadowy corridor that opened into a cramped courtyard piled high with old crates and barrels. A half-dozen men wearing the City Watch sigil stood there, looking anxious. One, presumably their captain, bowed low before Renly. "My lord, your grace," he whispered. "We've undone the wards, just as promised. You'll find the route to the Red Keep lightly guarded. Most men are on the outer walls or with the king. Word is they're more worried about your siege towers." Renly tried to mask his relief. If this was no trick, the city would fall tonight with minimal bloodshed. He pressed a gold stag into the captain's hand and told him to stand aside with his men. As quietly as they could, Renly's force moved deeper into the sleeping city. What they found in the first few streets was a surreal hush. The buildings pressed in on them, wooden shutters closed, not a lamp lit. Most of the population was locked away, hungry and afraid. Occasionally, a curtain twitched, a face peering out at the passing knights, but no outcry was raised. They crossed cobblestone streets, heading uphill toward the Red Keep. In the distance, they heard the faint wails of cats in the alleys, or a distant drunken cry. The City Watch stationed near the keep were not expecting an infiltration from within, so the watchers on the gates were sparse, easy to surprise. Renly's knights rushed forward, subduing the guards with quick, mostly non-lethal blows. A shout rose, but it was over almost as soon as it began. The group forced open the main doors of the castle. Inside, torchlight glowed on the polished floors. Tall corridors stretched in every direction, the architecture a testament to Targaryen grandeur. A small group of Lannister guards rushed at them near the throne room, presumably alerted by the sounds of fighting. Loras and Tarly cut them down. Shouts and clanging steel reverberated through the halls. Renly and his men pressed on, following the route to the grand staircase leading up to the Great Hall. More guards tried to bar their way, but the Tyrell knights overwhelmed them. Blood stained the marble floors, the walls echoed with yells, but it was far from the pitched carnage of a full siege. At last, Renly reached the doors of the throne room. He forced them open, breath catching at the sight of the iron throne at the far end, illuminated by towering windows that let in the moonlight. Joffrey stood at the base of the steps, wearing a gilded crown too large for his young head. His mother, Cersei Lannister, was by his side in a flowing gown of crimson. The Kingsguard stood before them, Ser Boros Blunt, Ser Meryn Trant, and a few others. They looked uncertain, glancing at the knights flooding in. Tyrion Lannister stood off to one side, his expression unreadable. Renly pushed back his visor. This was the moment. "Joffrey," he said, voice echoing. I come to claim the throne in Robert Baratheon's name. You are no true Baratheon. Surrender, and I will spare your life." Joffrey trembled, but he tried to hide it behind a sneer. "You have no right," he shouted. His voice cracked. He gestured wildly at his Kingsguard. "Kill them. Kill them all." Ser Meryn Trant took an uncertain step forward, but the Tyrell Knights already had him surrounded. Cersei placed a hand on Joffrey's arm, hissing something in his ear. Tyrion, stepping forward, raised both hands in a show of placation. "Nephew," he said quietly, "perhaps we should." But Joffrey had no desire to yield. He reached for a crossbow leaning against the throne, an ornate piece with golden filigree. In a flash of reckless rage, he loosed a bolt at Renly. The bolt missed by inches, clattering against a pillar. Renly's men rushed forward. Cersei let out a shrill scream, dragging Joffrey back toward the throne, as if the twisted seat of melted swords could protect him. A swirl of motion erupted. The Kingsguard tried to defend their king, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Swords scraped and sparks flew. One of Renly's knights disarmed Ser Meryn with a quick blow. Another pinned Ser Boros against a pillar. Renly strode across the hall, sword gripped tight, eyes fixed on the shaking boy king. "It's over," he growled. "Surrender the throne." Joffrey was half sobbing, half spitting curses. He pointed the empty crossbow at Renly again, but one of the Tyrell Knights wrenched it from his hands. As if the reality finally sank in, Joffrey slid to his knees. Cersei glared at Renly, fury and terror warring in her green eyes, but she said nothing. Tyrion watched, face like stone. Renly exhaled. So little had separated them from carnage in the streets. Perhaps some part of him expected a final reversal, a hidden wildfire cache set to explode. But there was only silence as Joffrey surrendered. Renly signaled his men to take Joffrey into custody, to secure Cersei. Tyrion offered no resistance, though his eyes flickered with cunning. Outside, dawn was breaking over King's Landing, painting the sky pink and gold. Word spread like wildfire through the capital. The gates were opened, King Renly's forces had entered, and the usurpers had been deposed. The gold cloaks, having been bribed or intimidated, quickly surrendered their posts. People emerged from their homes cautiously. Some in flea bottom cheered, others simply watched with faces hollowed by hunger. Renly gave orders to maintain strict discipline. There would be no raping or looting from his men. He had come to bring justice, not another horror. Within an hour, the Red Keep was effectively under his control. Joffrey, stripped of his crown, was confined to his chambers under heavy guard. Cersei raged, threatening that Tywin Lannister would march and destroy them all. Tyrion, for his part, pleaded with Renly to allow at least some measure of dignity for his sister, hinting that the Lannister father's wrath would be terrible if the Queen Mother was mistreated. Renly tried to see reason. If he executed the boy, the Lannisters in the Westerlands would never forgive him. But if he let Joffrey live, he would be a focal point for rebellion. For the moment, though, the immediate crisis was past. Renly sent ravens to every corner of the realm, proclaiming himself king on the Iron Throne by right of blood, announcing Joffrey's true parentage, and offering amnesty to any who bent the knee. Loras Tyrell, battered but unhurt, knelt before Renly in the throne room and presented him with the battered crown of Robert Baratheon, a golden circlet with points in the shape of antlers. Softly, Loras said, "A Baratheon crown for a Baratheon king." Renly stood at the base of the Iron Throne. He looked up at that terrifying seat, forged of 1,000 melted swords. The seat was all edges and cruelty, as if it could never grant comfort. Hesitating only a moment, he ascended, turned, and settled himself upon the Iron Throne. The hall was filled with Tyrell knights, Stormland lords, and some city watchmen who had ventured to watch the momentous occasion. They knelt, raising their swords in salute. In their eyes he saw hope, fervor, and perhaps fear. Marjorie stepped forward, bowing with regal grace, then rose to stand at his side. A hush enveloped the hall. King Renly Baratheon, victor at Storm's End, brother slayer and uniters of the Reach and the Stormlands, had claimed the seat once held by Targaryen dragons and his own brother Robert. He tried to speak, but for a moment words failed him. He looked to Loras, to Marjorie, to the men he now ruled. Was he truly ready for this? The memory of Stannis's final breath flickered through his mind. No turning back now. Summoning all the courage he could, he told himself that he would be a different king. One who cared for the people, who brokered alliances rather than forging them in blood. And so he lifted his voice, clear and resonant. I am Renly of the House Baratheon, first of my name, King of the Undulls, the Roiner, and the First Men, and Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. I swear to rule justly, to uphold the oaths that bind us, and to bring a lasting peace to this realm. May the Seven guide me, and may I be found worthy of the crown I wear. Outside, in the city, the bells began to toll, announcing change. In the squares and alleyways, some cried out in joy, others in despair, and many in confusion. But the sun rose higher, gilding the spires of the great September of Baelor. And in that morning light, King Renly Baratheon sat upon the Iron Throne, having defeated his brother at Storm's End and taken the seat of power he had so coveted.